So all of the other stories I've read on this channel that I've written so far have been stories I've written very recently. I think the oldest story I read was Ancient History, which I wrote back in September of last year. This story is a lot older than those stories. I wrote this story back when I was 16, and it may or may not have started its life as a Portal fanfiction about Doug Ratman. Woo! Eventually I ended up making it its own thing because I realized it literally had nothing to do with Portal, and why was I still bothering to make the connection? So eventually it became its own thing. So it is an original story, which has nothing to do with Portal at all, except the main character is still named Doug, but, you know, whatever. So the good thing about it being written when I was 16 is that that's right when I kind of hit my writing plateau. And for those of you who don't know what that means, basically when you first start writing, and especially if you start writing when you're young, your skill at writing improves rapidly as you start reading more advanced things and you start writing and starting to realize, you know, what works, what doesn't work. But there's eventually, you hit the point where your writing kind of plateaus. And what that means is your skill is still improving, but in a lot more subtle ways and a lot of ways that you can't see as easy. And so, this means that, you know, when I was 16, looking back on stuff I'd written at age 14 made me absolutely cringe. But now I can still read this story and I still think it's a good story. I mean, there's definitely some things I would have changed about it, or I probably would have written it very differently if I wrote it today. But for what it was at the time, I still think it's a really good story. The bad thing about it being written when I was 16 is that it's angsty as fuck. I still love angst, don't get me wrong. Angst is still a major part of what I do, but I like to think I'm a lot more subtle with my angst now than I was here. That being said, the main character is also 16 years old, so I did a very accurate portrayal of what a 16-year-old's head is like, but, yeah, it's a little angsty. It's, the language is a little bit coarse in places because swearing is really cool when you're 16. So, yeah, this was supposed to be part of a longer story, and then, you know, about 3,000 words in, I realized I had no fucking idea where I was going with it, and so I kind of just stopped writing it because I didn't know what I was going to do with the story. So I'm going to stop it at kind of a weird place, and it really doesn't have a conclusion, and I apologize for that. The good news about that is that this is an idea that I'm thinking of recycling into a new story, which is half the reason I'm coming back to this. But it would be worked in a very different way. So, yeah. I guess, without further ado, here is This Is Not a Cancer Book, Part 1, in which he checks himself into the loony bin. There was no Part 2 or Part 3 or anything. Sorry. "Well, Douglas," the doctor said, holding her clipboard and smiling at him, "I really think that you're going to like it here." Doug snorted. There were a lot of things he really wanted to say to her, starting with, "Maybe I would if you'd stop treating me like I'm frickin' 5 years old," and ending with something along the lines of, "Fuck off," or "This place sucks dicks." But he didn't. That wouldn't prove anything. Because Doug most certainly wasn't 5. He was 16. Hell, he would be cruising around in his new Corvette right now if the voices in his head would just shut the frick up. It had all started about 6 months ago, when Doug first heard the voices. But it didn't worry him. Everyone talked to themselves, right? But then the voices started to take on a mind of their own, and Doug started to feel paranoid around things that had never bugged him before, like security cameras. He constantly felt like he was being watched. He'd been able to hide it for a few months, that is, until he'd had a panic attack / nervous breakdown in the middle of AP Calculus. That was what had got him sent here. The doctor led Doug down a long white corridor. He didn't belong here. If there was one thing that Doug wasn't, it was crazy. "We're almost there," the doctor smiled. "I really do think you'll like it here," she repeated, as if he would actually believe her the more she said it. "Well, just hand me my straitjacket and plop me in a padded cell," Doug deadpanned. The doctor frowned. Doug glanced at her innocently. The doctor adjusted her glasses. "This is not an asylum, Mr. Bailey," she said. "Really? I couldn't tell. This hallway just kind of screams insane asylum." "We are here to help you recover. There are no straitjackets here, and your family can visit you as much as you like." Doug scoffed. His family would never visit him, even if he'd wanted them to, which he certainly didn't. That was why they dropped him here in the first place, because they didn't want to deal with him. His mother, an Oxford grad with 3 doctorates in quantum physics, biology, and chemistry, currently a professor at Princeton. His father, a Harvard grad, currently a professor at his alma mater, and a published author of several books which had allegedly changed the American diet. He had 2 brothers as well. The oldest, Josh, was a big-shot lawyer in New York, the favorite of everyone, their parents included. In truth, Doug always thought that he was kind of a dick, but Doug's parents loved him. His second brother, Gordon, was the classic middle child and hated their parents almost as much as Doug did. He'd even gone so far as to change his last name as soon as he turned 18 just to get away from them. Last Doug heard, Gordon was working as a lab technician at some research facility in New Mexico while getting his PhD. And then there was Doug. More like disappointment Doug. He wasn't charismatic like Josh or intelligent like Gordon. No. Wait, he could be intelligent if he only applied himself. His mandatory IQ test proved that much. Turned out that Doug was a genius with an IQ straight through the roof. Not an Einstein by any means. His IQ was all the way to outer space, but a low-grade genius. His mother had wept tears of joy when his results came in the mail. "It's even higher than Gordon's," she had exclaimed. Doug, on the other hand, certainly didn't feel like a genius. Sure, school came easy, so easy in fact that he didn't even have to try, and he really didn't. But geniuses were people who did big things, and other people always remembered them. Doug was about as memorable as floral wallpaper. He was a little punk with a dirty mouth and a deplorable attitude, basically like any other teenager. That is, until this whole mess started. His relationship with his parents had never been great. Now they treated him like he was a delicate piece of china that would break if you spoke too loudly. That was why he tried to hide it. He wasn't a freak, and he didn't want to be treated like one. He hadn't been scared. Not really. He knew what was going on. Doug had diagnosed himself long before any doctor. It was easy. He just looked up his symptoms in one of his dad's medical journals, and boom, there it was, right at the top of the list. Schizophrenia. He'd been a little freaked out at first, but he'd done some research on the internet, history equals delete, 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 and found that it wasn't as bad as people made it out to be. It could be controlled. Unless it got worse, which Doug was sure it wasn't, it was easy to hide. But then it did start to get worse. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and Doug was often nervous. He jumped at sudden noises, locked his bedroom door at night, and he'd even had to tape over the webcam on his laptop because he kept getting the feeling that it was watching him. But he was dealing, still in control. Until that one day in calculus. Doug had been staring at his calculator, trying to look like he was concentrating. His leg bouncing up and down in nervousness, but this wasn't strange for him. His heart, though, was doing somersaults in his chest, and he had no idea why. The teacher at the front of the classroom was droning on about something or other, except that Doug was finding it increasingly harder to look like he was paying attention because the voices in his head were droning too. He knew that they weren't real, but tried telling them that because he already had. They were so insistent, nagging at him, and oh God, the door to the hallway was open, and Doug didn't know why that scared him, but it did, and now there was this high-pitched whining in his ears, and Doug just wanted it all to stop. He threw his calculator on the ground and stomped on it, smashing the damn thing to pieces, and he screamed, "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" No sound. The classroom had gone silent. His head had gone quiet as well. Finally, it was fucking quiet. Doug was so happy that he started laughing. Everyone was staring at him, but he could not give a shit. Doug walked to the door, shut it, it clicked satisfyingly, and sat back down at his desk. Grinning from ear to ear, Doug said, "Really sorry about that. Please continue." His parents had been contacted, of course. What else would he have expected? And they had set up a meeting with the principal to discuss just what to do with him. They discussed options, psychiatrists, professional help, and most importantly, an extended vacation, aka suspension, during which he would be exempt from all missing work. They thought it was stress. Poor little Doug was just overworked. Their minds were so busy trying to rationalize the concept that a 16-year-old boy had suddenly lost it that they didn't notice the answer that was right in front of them. His counselor suggested that he drop one of his 4 AP classes, but his parents protested on his behalf. The principal turned to him. "You've been awfully quiet, Doug. What's on your mind?" he asked, not unkindly. Doug had paused. Should he tell? But he dismissed that idea quickly. They'd never believe him. Never believe that a teenage kid was able to diagnose his own damn mental disorder. Or they'd think he was crazy. Well, crazier than he was, anyway. "I think you're barking up the wrong tree, Mr. Betcher." That got him some strange looks, but chalk it all up to the fact that he'd just have a nervous breakdown in front of 30 people. He could afford to be cryptic. So they'd gotten him a psychiatrist. The best that money can buy, his father had said, and he went to the sessions, but he didn't tell the old bat a thing. Douglas, I can't help you if you don't tell me what's been bothering you, he'd said, as Doug lied for the millionth time from the classic black psychiatrist chair that he currently occupied. Nothing's wrong, Doc, said Doug, exasperated. But it clearly wasn't true. Anyone could see that. Doug fidgeted in the chair, nervous. It had gotten even worse in the last couple of weeks. The voices had been leaving him alone for the most part, but the paranoia had increased tenfold. He'd hardly left his room since his extended vacation had started. And the lock on his door just didn't seem to be enough, so he'd shoved a chair under the door handle for good measure. But still, he didn't tell. It wasn't as if he didn't want to tell someone, because he did, but telling someone would make it real. I might be inclined to believe you if that is you hadn't recently suffered from a nervous breakdown, said the psychiatrist, equally exasperated. That was it. Doug couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, the voices spurring him on. You want to know what's wrong, Doc? I've got fucking schizophrenia, that's what. I feel like I'm constantly being watched, and I'm always nervous, and I keep hearing these fucking voices in my head that sure as hell ain't mine. You think maybe that's why I had a freaking nervous breakdown in the middle of calculus, you pathetic shithead? Then he realized what he just said. It sounded crazy. He sounded crazy. Doug sat back down in the chair and covered his face with his hands. I need some fucking help. After that, his calm facade crumbled completely, and Doug told the psychiatrist everything. It was a fairly quick diagnosis, and it turned out that Doug had been right all along. Surprise! He had schizophrenia! Congratulations! Give the boy a medal. His parents had, of course, freaked. His mother sobbed, and his father said some very nasty things after the psychiatrist gave his good news, bad news speech that Doug had a feeling he'd given to a lot of people before. Good news, no serious nervous breakdown. Bad news, well, he kind of has a slight case of schizophrenia. A favorite phrase of Doug's father was, no son of mine will insert offense here, and he started to say it right there in the psychiatrist's office, but he stopped himself. Why? Doug surmised that unlike not going to college, Doug, or not taking that 5th AP class because it was simply too much work, Gordon, or partying and smoking pot, Josh, Doug's father simply had no control over his son's mental condition. It was slightly liberating to know that there was one thing in his life that his dad couldn't plan for. Sucks that it had to be his own twisted head. After the atmosphere in the office had cooled about 1,000 degrees, the psychiatrist explained that Doug's case was extremely rare because, on average, most people didn't start to display symptoms of schizophrenia until their mid-30s, and that he'd only had one other case like his in his decades of practicing psychiatry. He was also surprised that Doug had managed to hide it as long as he had. His parents demanded the cure, no matter how much it cost, and to Doug's twisted enjoyment, the psychiatrist confessed that there was no cure. Parents freak out number 2. But when he was finally able to talk over the extremely loud, extremely inappropriate accusations about the psychiatrist, his profession, and his mother, the psychiatrist explained that while there was no permanent cure, there were things that could be done. There were several very unattractive options, which both Doug and his parents dismissed quickly. There were a boatload of pills that Doug could take, to which Doug replied that he didn't really want to feel like a sick, bloated hippopotamus. Or, the psychiatrist mentioned hopefully, some of my colleagues at the Mental Wellness Center for Troubled Youth would be very interested in studying a unique case such as Doug's, so that they can better treat similar cases in the future. Of course, this for the good of science approach had appealed to his parents immediately, but all Doug could help thinking was, great, they want to make me a lab rat, that's just flipping fantastic. Here we are, the doctor said, stopping at a heavy metal door. The commons are through here. This was it. Welcome to the loony bin, Douglas. We hope you enjoy your stay. Welcome to the Mental Wellness Center for Troubled Youth, the doctor said. Doug scoffed. More like the Mental Institute for Fucked Up Rich Kids. That's not nice, said a voice in his head. You shouldn't say things like that. This was ridiculous. He had to have voices in his head, and they weren't even the cool ones that told you to kill people and stuff. You can shove it, Doug said. Excuse me? Asked the doctor. Oh, crap. He'd said that out loud. He shrugged. The voices made me do it? Doug said, the corners of his mouth twisting into a crooked smile. The doctor did not look amused. She opened the door without saying a thing. Doug saw with satisfaction that the door had several locks on it. There was finally someone who had enough sense to lock a door. I'm really sorry, but that's where it ends. There's a little bit more than I wrote, but it ends in an even weirder place. So that's the end of the story. I'm really sorry. But yeah, thanks. See you later.